Good Italian Catholic boys always listened to their mother, and Kansas City native George Cosconi was no exception.
I was a mommy's boy. My dad died when I was 11, so she was my mother and my father. I did everything my mom wanted me to do.
That included getting his mother's approval when it came to girls. So in September 1969, when a friend introduced 17-year-old George to a young beauty named Dorothy Luther, he immediately brought her home to meet his mother. Dorothy was sweet and shy, and George's mom took an instant liking to the girl.
My mom took her under her wing, more or less, and her and my mom were almost like best friends.
Under his mother's approving eye, George and Dorothy formed a close friendship, one that soon blossomed into love.
She was real quiet. She was real good looking. I was drawn to her because she had the same values that I had, and family and home and things like that.
My sister told me she found this fabulous guy. He had a great family, and that he would take care of her. This was like her knight in shining armor.
In the summer of 1973, George and Dorothy decided it was high time they made it official. That August, the two were married by the Justice of the Peace, with a few close friends and family in attendance.
Just had a couple of people. My mom was there, one of my best friends. I was happy. It was anticipation, a new life together.
My sister was extremely eager to get married. It was like a mission. George seemed nervous, a little edgy, but my sister, she was on her game. She was ready to go.
After their honeymoon, the newlyweds easily slipped into the peaceful routine of marriage. Dorothy was a doting wife who worked at a local restaurant, while George finished college and worked several jobs.
We lived in my mom's house and saved money to buy a house. She was a good wife. We very seldom argued or fought. She was very, very quiet, very reserved. I worked in a grocery store, and I also worked in a body shop and had a job selling real estate. My mom raised me to work, and that's what I did.
In 1976, the young couple welcomed a baby girl into the world. And by the following year, George bought his new family their own home. But shortly after the birth of their daughter, George began to glimpse a different side of his once loving wife.
Dorothy had changed. She used to be real quiet and, reserved. She became more vocal, very opinionated, very, dominating, controlling.
Dorothy also seemed utterly indifferent to George's personal belongings.
It was gradual. I noticed my stuff started dwindling. I'd have a few keepsake items on the shelf, and she would just box it all up and put it in the garage. I asked her, I said, where's this, where's that? She goes, I'll get it out. I can't do it right now. I'll do that later. Later never happened.
George wished his wife would be more considerate, but he had no time to wallow. As the household bills piled up, George worked even longer hours, while Dorothy constantly berated him.
All I was doing was working. There was no winning. She'd say, what are you going to do with these bills? She'd bring a big stack of bills out and she says, what are you going to do? Made me feel like the lowest thing on the planet.
George tried to keep his chin up and continue doing what he thought best for his family. But as the years went on, Dorothy's behavior went from bad to worse to outright horrifying. On the evening of July 5th, 2010, George was entertaining friends at home when suddenly around midnight there was a knock at his front door.
I went to the door and it was the police and the FBI. And they asked me to step out and talk to them, and I asked them what they were here for.
We explained to him what had been going on with Dorothy. We began to believe that she was going to follow through with her plan. She referred to the entire thing as a game.
She thought she was above the law.
In the spring of 1979, 31 years before George Cosconi received some shocking news, he was working hard to provide a good life for his wife Dorothy and their 3-year-old daughter.
I was always double jobbing it, always working all the time. I want to make sure they didn't long for something or feel like they were doing without.
George was thriving in his professional life. he took on a string of rental properties and buildings, and money finally began coming in. But the road to marital bliss was becoming bumpier than ever.
She controlled everything I did. She used to be real quiet and, reserved. Now she's just 180 degrees the other way.
And by 1984, after their second daughter was born, another set of problems surfaced.
The spending is where it really kind of started. It seemed like the spending just would spiral out of control. It was crazy.
Dorothy would buy anything and everything. She loved to buy shoes, clothes, and anything shiny or glittery. Or if it had a leopard print on it, she was all for it.
I told her we had to put the brakes on the credit cards. She just went into a rage and just started ransacking the place. She started knocking everything over, tearing everything up, just going totally bonkers. So I just backed off.
George decided to focus on keeping the peace with his wife, but Dorothy seemed to have other plans. One night in June of 1985, George came home to find his wife fuming over an unsigned insurance claim check.
Big hailstorm hit Kansas City. When the check came for the hail damage, I didn't see it. When I got home, she goes, "You didn't sign that check." She made it sound like I wouldn't sign it, like it was something that was my fault. She got so mad.
But there was more to the story. Dorothy finally admitted that she had tried to cash the check anyway.
She just told me she was in a hurry. She ran to the bank, stuffed it in the teller's face, and they wouldn't cash it because it wasn't signed. So she was mad.
Dorothy's insatiable appetite for money was troubling. Still, George did his best to keep his marriage together. But the distance between the couple only grew. That same year, a frustrated and demoralized George sought comfort in the arms of a close friend.
I just wanted to find a little happiness for myself, but I didn't feel good about it. Dorothy found out about the affair. She was enraged. I did apologize to her numerous times, but it just made her more enraged to talk about it.
By now, George knew the way to his wife's heart was through his wallet.
I just threw more money at it, just let her have more control of my money. I did hope things would get better.
By the summer of 1986, things finally seemed to be looking up. George opened his own auto body shop in Kansas City, and Dorothy offered to do her part for the family business.
She was there all the time. She paid all the bills and wrote all the checks and took care of everything.
George hoped the joint venture would help their marriage. But by the end of that year, he began noticing large amounts of money missing from his business.
I was working 20 hours a day and still broke, and I knew that some of the dealership accounts were 10, 12 grand a month. I mean, I should have had more money.
George had a sinking feeling his wife was stealing from him.
I just kind of turned a blind eye to it. I thought that I owed it to her for what I'd done, having the affair.
So in 1991, George suggested that Dorothy open her own business, a wig salon, in one of his properties.
Well, I had hoped that she would be able to make enough money to be able to support her lifestyle the way she wanted to.
But over time, it became clear that Dorothy had no intention of leaving George's bank account alone.
She just always took my money to run her business. She paid all her employees out of my checking account. She paid her utilities and her insurance out of my checking account. I just tolerated it because I felt like I owed it to her for what I did. I tried to pay her back every way I could.
I think my sister is probably the most greedy person I've ever known in my life. She just has to have everything. It was almost like a game to her.
By 1996, the couple's already strained relationship only got worse when George's mother became ill. When she passed away 3 years later, the last remaining connection George and Dorothy had was severed.
Almost immediately, she served me with the final divorce papers. She was more revealing in her hostility after my mom died.
With his troubled marriage finally over, George set his sights on a more peaceful future. But things with Dorothy weren't over just yet. In fact, they were about to get much, much worse.
When I found out she sold his body to science, I was just in shock.
She had transformed into a monster.
In the summer of 1999, after a 26-year tumultuous marriage, George and his wife Dorothy Casconi called it quits. Despite everything, George was determined to make sure Dorothy wanted for nothing.
In the divorce, I let her have numerous properties, all my car collection, and everything that I had, all the houses, everything. Felt like I had to protect her.
There was just one thing George wanted to hold on to: his mother's house.
I wanted to keep that. I built that house with my mom in 1965, and I designed it. The house meant a lot to me. It was a very sentimental place to me.
But George didn't know that Dorothy had plans of her own.
She got my mother's house. When I signed off the rental properties to her, she attached the legal description to those documents as if I had signed it off with the other rental properties. And so she successfully got it from me lock, stock, and barrel. I felt real stupid. That was one of the things I cherished the most.
It's a big control issue with her because she wants to be totally in control of everything. And it was just important to her. It's almost like to be superior.
Even worse, shortly after their divorce, Dorothy remarried. George decided it was time to play hardball.
When I bought a new building, she wanted to put her wig shop in there real bad. She says, "Is there anything I can do to get my business in your new building?" You know, rent-free, of course. And I said, "I think you want something from me. I want something from you. You can sign me back on my mom's house." And she just was kind of taken aback by it.
But ultimately, the deal was too sweet for Dorothy to resist. And in 2002, she reluctantly agreed to George's terms. George hoped the battles with his ex-wife were now over. But by 2006, tensions between George and Dorothy reached a new level.
Dorothy was struggling in her business. She wasn't focused on her business. She was more focused on her image.
I got tired of paying the taxes. I sold the building, so she had to get completely out. She was real mad and outraged. It was one of the best things I ever did. She finally ended up moving her business into her house. So at that point, effectively, she was what they call belly up.
George was relieved to wash his hands of his irresponsible ex, especially when he got wind of a disturbing bit of news. In 2009, Dorothy's second husband passed away. Everyone was horrified to discover what Dorothy did with his body.
Immediately, she sold his body to science so that she could get the money for that and she wouldn't have to pay for a funeral to cut the expenses. I think you get something like $250 or something like that. I mean, it's so minimal, it's crazy. I was just in shock.
She talked about it several times. She talked about doing the same thing with George. It's a cheap way out. I was angry. I was angry for his family.
She's very methodical. I felt really lucky I got divorced when I did.
By 2010, George had finally moved on, leaving the ugly memory of his ex-wife's scheming behind. Until July 5th, when George had some unexpected visitors.
I was at home with my friends here. We were just hanging around. It was late at night, around 12:30, and somebody was knocking on the door. I went to the door, and it was the police and the FBI.
We wanted to let George know what was going on and what we had done to protect his safety. We asked him to step outside.
They said, "We have something to tell you. Did you made anybody mad recently?" And I said, "Well, my business, I make a lot of people mad." And they said, "Well, what about in the past?"
George answered with the one person he knew disliked him in all of Kansas City.
And I immediately knew it was my ex-wife. And they said, "Well, we have her in custody down for a murder for hire plot to have you killed." I was surprised to think that she would hate me that much after I had helped her.
But that was just the beginning. What really floored George was how Dorothy had gone about her insidious plan.
She hired a thief to do a killer's work. She hired the wrong kind of criminal.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On July 5th, 2010, George Cascone was standing on his doorstep dumbfounded as federal agents and local police delivered some unbelievable news.
They said, well, we have your ex-wife in custody down for a murder for hire plot to have you killed.
Investigators went on to say that Dorothy Cascone had attempted to hire a hitman to do away with George. But instead of doing the job, the hitman went straight to the FBI.
He had known Dorothy for several weeks and had somewhat of a relationship with her. He believed that this was a credible threat.
The would-be hitman told the FBI that Dorothy wanted George shot around midnight on the 4th of July.
She wanted it done on that day because of the fireworks that were going off for the 4th of July, and she believed that this would minimize any kind of other individual hearing what was going on. He provided 3 handwritten drawings that Dorothy had given him of the different levels of the home, a .38 caliber handgun that was loaded.
He also told the FBI that Dorothy offered him $2,000 to kill George. The FBI immediately contacted the Kansas City Police Department, and together they planned an undercover sting operation using the informant.
We provided this individual with the recorder, and he was then sent back to Dorothy Cascone's home. He asked Dorothy, "How do you want George shot? 1 time, 2 times?" She responded, "I don't care, I just want him dead." After the money exchange and the loaded weapons and hearing the conversations, we were confident there was an actual threat to George.
The FBI and police wasted no time. They arrested Dorothy and charged her with first-degree assault.
My older niece called me and said, "You need to turn the TV on. Mom's on TV." And I said, "What channel?" I thought, gosh, she's really done a good job this time.
After the FBI informed George of Dorothy's arrest, a news crew showed up at his home later that day. And he was not shy in expressing how he felt.
The part that insulted me the most is the fact that she was going to pay the hitman so little money. I mean, $2,000 is just not enough money.
George also had a little piece of advice for his ex-wife.
She should have took somebody from out of town, Chicago or New York, and she should have paid them at least 10 grand. 2 grand is not enough to get that kind of work done right. So instead, she get what you pay for.
She hired a thief to do a killer's work. She hired the wrong kind of criminal.
Shortly after his ex-wife's arrest, George learned that Dorothy had several life insurance policies she had taken out in his name. If her plan had gone off without a hitch, she could have inherited close to $1 million.
She would have ended up with this house, my buildings, and I guess $1 million almost.
On March 29, 2011, Dorothy Cascone pleaded guilty to second-degree assault. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
I was pretty shocked for what she had done. I thought that was a pretty light sentence.
When someone who's never had any control and never had any money, and you suddenly give them power and control, they can't handle it. It goes to their head. She wanted to call all the shots on everything, and for a long time she did, and I allowed it.
Today, George is still struggling to move past everything that happened, so he focuses most of his energy on his business and his beloved granddaughter.
I don't have to work 20 hours a day. I don't have somebody stealing money from me constantly. I get to see my granddaughter more now, and I get to build a relationship with her. And that's important.
George is still pretty much himself. That's one of the things I like. He doesn't put on this fake persona. He remains true to who he is.
Still, George admits that forming new relationships has been tough.
I'd never get married again. When you get married, you give someone the legal right to totally jack you over. I mean, it's like, here, take everything. Here's my keys. I surrender. I can't do that for anybody now.
Andrea Merriman always knew that money couldn't buy happiness.
I grew up in a very financially prosperous but down-to-earth family. And I remember as a teenager when my dad died unexpectedly in a plane crash, and I saw his Mercedes sitting in the driveway, and it hit me clearly, wow, this life really isn't about money, and you can't take it with you.
But even though she wasn't focused on material things, Andrea was practical and wise beyond her 20 years when it came to love.
I remember when I was a teenager making out a list of what I would want someday in my future husband. The three most important qualities for me would have been faith, their ability to provide for myself and my future family, and then how they treated me.
So in the fall of 1988, when most of her female peers at Brigham Young University were chasing handsome athletes, Andrea was looking for a man with more enduring qualities. And she found them in a fellow student named Sean Merriman.
Sean was a very, very nice, honest guy. And I realized the more I talked to him how very intelligent he was. He was kind of a student entrepreneur and started his own custom home stereo installation company and did very well. And he was generous with what he had.
Like Andrea, Sean was a member of the Mormon Church, and she was instantly drawn to him.
Sean was the first guy I dated that could do all those Hollywood romantic gestures and make them seem real, not cheesy. I thought he was the dream man that I'd been looking for.
I was very excited for her. I thought they got along really well.
It seemed Sean thought so too. And in the spring of 1989, after 6 months of dating, he proposed. And Andrea said yes. 3 months later, Sean and Andrea were wed at the Mormon Temple.
Our wedding day was a great day. It was happy, it was full of hope and promise for the future.
In April of 1990, the newlyweds packed up and moved to Denver, Colorado, where Sean would pursue a master's degree in business.
When we got to Denver, he began his job as an investment banker and realized he didn't need an MBA to do that job. He worked for 3 months and made $50,000.
Pretty soon, other companies were courting Sean and offering him signing bonuses of up to $80,000 to switch firms.
I think that he appealed to employers because he was very smart and he was very sure of himself.
Within a year, Sean was making a lot of money, and he was spending a lot too.
Well, Sean brought expensive taste to our marriage. I think that in Sean's mind, he had missed out on some things in his childhood, whether it be financial or emotional. And I think it meant a lot to him to be able to finally have those things that he had dreamed of. I figured as long as our basic needs were met and we were, not having priorities that were too worldly or too messed up, then we were doing okay.
But 20 years later, Andrea would learn the devastating truth about her husband's real priorities. And this revelation would shatter their picture-perfect family life. On March 18, 2009, Andrea was out running errands when her cell phone rang. It was her husband, Sean.
Sean asked me what I was doing, and he said, I was hoping to spend time with you this morning. So I turned the car around and drove home and met him at our house. And when I walked into the room he was in, he was on the phone with someone. So I sat at the table and waited while he finished his conversation.
When Sean hung up the phone, he turned to Andrea and revealed a devastating secret he'd been keeping from her for over a decade.
I felt like I had been thrust in the biggest, blackest, deepest, darkest hole, and I didn't know how I was going to get out of it.
I thought, this can't be really true. This can't be happening to this family.
As soon as we heard about it, we knew this was going to be a huge story.
In the spring of 1993, 16 years before a devastating secret destroyed her life, Andrea Merriman and her husband Sean were well on their way to building their American dream.
In April, we had our first child. So we moved to a custom-built home in a neighborhood where all the homes were on 1 to 3 acres. So it was kind of a dream come true.
Sean's hard work was paying off, and Andrea was enjoying the benefits.
As soon as she started having children, she stayed home, and that became her career.
Andrea initially tried her hand at managing the family finances, but it soon became clear that money was Sean's territory.
Sean brought in the money, and Sean paid all of the bills. I didn't know what obligations we had. We decided it just worked better for him to be in charge.
Sean took care of most of the finances. I think that's what he did well. He made sure everybody had even more than they wanted. He provided for his kids very well.
As the months went by, Sean's career seemed to skyrocket, and in the fall of 1993, he told Andrea about a big business decision he had made.
So he told me that he had some clients who had asked him to leave the investment banking business and manage money privately for them.
Sean opened his company, Market Street Advisors, in 1994. He built an office in the basement of the family home. With a separate entrance he always kept locked. The very nature of Sean's business meant keeping his wife in the dark when it came to his work.
We set up some ground rules that the basement was off limits to my children and I in the day, and that's how he was able to work and run his business. I never knew any specific details as to who his clients were or how much money they had invested. I am a great believer in privacy, and other people's money is not my business.
Only once, shortly after starting his business, Sean confided in Andrea about a work-related concern.
He had been puzzled and stressed for a few days. I could just tell something was bothering him. He was quiet. I asked him what was wrong, and he just said, "Oh, it's just something, I'll take care of it. I have a problem at work. I just need to figure out how to solve it."
Sean explained to Andrea that the source of his stress was an accounting problem he had been struggling to resolve.
And then a few days later, he came to me and said, "Oh, I'm so relieved. I figured out how to solve my accounting problem." And I thought, okay, everything will be fine.
Over the next several years, Sean's income grew as steadily as his family. By 2005, Sean and Andrea were the parents of 4 children. And Sean had taken on a prestigious role of bishop at their church.
When Sean became a bishop for our church, it was a big deal. You're only called to be a bishop if you're a very worthy member.
Andrea was proud of her upstanding husband. In fact, the only contention between the two was Sean's increasingly ostentatious spending.
Sean enjoyed buying all different kinds of things. Cars had always been a passion. He bought Ferraris, Porsches, all kinds of luxury cars. He bought art. Sean built a building behind our home that was almost 5,000 square feet. It was massive. He had his showroom, and it was a giant room that had all of his animal trophies from around the world. And it had art storage, it had everything, that he could possibly want. And it was more than a man cave, it was his man palace.
Andrea had no choice but to accept Sean's expensive hobbies. It never even crossed her mind that behind her husband's insatiable appetite for luxury was a problem much more disturbing than overspending.
When he started to cry, I realized, oh my gosh, I think this is real.
It was like pulling a rug out from under her feet.
In the spring of 2005, Andrea Merriman was beginning to feel uncomfortable with her husband Sean's extravagant spending habits, even though Sean could very well afford his expensive tastes.
Sean's business was continuing to do very, very well, and many people were approaching him to manage their money. I think he was at the height of his success.
And even though Sean didn't discuss business with his wife, Andrea didn't mind giving him his privacy in that respect.
My husband had a business, and he dealt in issues that were private and confidential. And he told me it wasn't my business, and I agreed that it wasn't my business, so it didn't bother me at all.
But one day, when Andrea picked up Sean's open laptop to check her email, she was taken aback by his reaction.
He was very uncomfortable with that and told me, "What are you doing? You shouldn't be on my computer." And I was so surprised that he reacted that way. I just looked at him and said, "I cannot believe you. You have so much privacy in your life. You know, you have your own cell phone, you have your own office, you have your own building. You could be living a secret life for all I know." And he looked at me and said, "You're right, I'm sorry."
From that point on, Sean left his computer out in the open for Andrea to check whenever she wanted. Life for the couple carried on as usual, and Andrea was overjoyed when Sean told her he'd made the final mortgage payment on their house.
I know that having her house paid off gave her a sense of security, that she would always have a home for her children.
When Sean told me that our home was paid off, I was just happy. I had something that I'd wanted for a long time, and it represented security to me.
But by 2008, Andrea was feeling a little less secure in her marriage. Over the years, Sean's passion for material things had begun to overshadow his passion for his family. He spent more and more time away, buying art at auctions in London and shooting big game on safaris in Africa.
He was gone too much. Andrea had no support. I didn't think it was fair for him to go off on those long things by himself, and it was all about him.
On top of everything, when Sean was home, he seemed exceptionally cranky. Andrea chalked her husband's moodiness up to an ongoing IRS audit of his finances.
At some point, the IRS decided to audit him, and it took all of 2008. And Sean was getting more and more worked up about it and angry about it.
But when the audit uncovered nothing unusual, the Merrimans breathed a sigh of relief. Sean seemed to be back to his generous, good-natured self. And on March 13th, he sent Andrea off on a surprise trip to New York City with her girlfriends.
He arranged a room for us at an amazing hotel and had a limo pick me up at the airport. And we went to shows and just had a dream vacation.
While Andrea was away, she knew her husband Sean had been holed up in his office working his usual long hours. So when she returned home, Andrea was surprised to find their voicemail full of urgent messages.
They were all for Sean. Then my cell phone started receiving calls for Sean, which I thought was interesting, and clients were calling saying, "We're trying to reach Sean, where is he?" I really didn't know what was going on, so I just figured maybe he had bitten off more than he could chew, and he was a little behind in returning phone calls.
Andrea passed the messages on to Sean and went on with her routine. She thought everything was fine until March 18th, 2009.
I was headed out to run errands, and Sean called me on my cell phone, and he said, "I was hoping to spend time with you this morning." And I thought, that's kind of odd. It should be a work day, but I figured I'd been out of town, life had been busy, and maybe he just needed to talk. So I turned the car around and drove home and met him at our house. And when I walked into the room he was in, he was on the phone with someone, which was not unusual. So I sat at the table and waited while he finished his conversation. So when he got off the phone, he sat down across from me at the table.
Andrea was not at all prepared for the words that came out of Sean's mouth next.
And he looked at me without emotion and said, "My company is a sham."
Sean Merriman basically stole $20 million from investors.
It's something that you see on TV. It's not something that you live through or watch other people live through.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In March of 2009, Andrea Merriman's husband Sean sat her down and told her that the business he had been running for 15 years was a fake.
He wasn't emotional. He wasn't angry. He didn't look devastated. He just seemed very normal as he sat across the table from me and told me. He said, "My company, Market Street Advisors, is a sham. All these years that you thought that I was running an investment company, I've actually been running a Ponzi scheme." I really didn't understand what a Ponzi scheme was, and he told me that he was taking money from investors and then using that to live on, as well as pay other investors as they withdrew money, and that in reality, he hadn't bought or sold a stock in many years.
Sean told Andrea that he felt so guilty he had decided to turn himself in to authorities. All their possessions would be confiscated, and Sean knew he'd be going to prison.
And I remember saying, "Well, at least the house is paid off." And he said, "No, you don't understand. Our house is gone, our cars are gone, everything is gone. You're left with nothing. I'm sorry, you're on your own." So I believed all along I was living in a paid-off home, but it wasn't. It was mortgaged, I just didn't know it.
She went from having Rembrandt paintings on the wall to wondering how she was going to be able to feed her children dinner.
Sean Merriman's downfall quickly became front-page news.
Well, when the story broke after he turned himself in, it was a huge story in Denver because of the number of people that were impacted by it and the devastating results it had on so many people's lives. The Bernie Madoff story had been huge news, and so people were getting very familiar with the idea of a Ponzi scheme, but it felt very New York City, I think. And when it happened here in Colorado, it just took on a different meaning because it was happening close to home.
As more information leaked out, it became clear that Sean had bilked friends, fellow church members, and even family out of $20 million.
I had money with him that my mom had left me, and then it was gone. I felt like it was a betrayal of everything that we ever knew. I felt like we didn't even know him.
Sean Merriman frauded people out of their life savings, out of their retirement. He told them he was investing money and that their money was growing, and he was spending the money instead.
As Sean's elaborate web of lies continued to unravel, Andrea realized that she was right when she joked about him living a double life. She discovered the Ponzi scheme was Sean's solution to the minor accounting problem he encountered when he first started his business.
Eventually, I thought back to the conversation early in his investment company career when he'd had a problem and then he had solved it and said, "Okay, everything's going to be fine." And everything wasn't fine. From that moment on, it was like a bomb in our family, in our life, in our marriage that was ticking away, and I never even knew it was there.
Over the next 4 months, Andrea lived in agonizing limbo as Sean awaited his day in court, while still living at their family home.
I found out in a moment that I was living with a stranger. He anticipated being taken into custody within 6 to 7 weeks. So I thought I had 6 to 7 weeks to find a job, find a place to live, and try to find a life for my children and I.
In July of 2009, Andrea finalized her divorce from Sean, packed up her kids, and moved to Utah where she could start over.
Single mom, 4 children, 2 dogs, no house, no money, no prospects. I had a lot of misperceptions about me. I felt that I was being judged. And you just come to a point where you have to let it all go.
In December of 2009, Andrea watched from afar as Sean pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony mail fraud. 9 months later, on September 14, 2010, he was sentenced to 12.5 years in federal prison.
We talked to victims outside the courtroom who really said that no number of years was going to feel right or okay because so many people lost everything they had.
Today, Andrea Merriman is remarried and is a busy working mom juggling 4 children and a public relations job.
My life is very, very different now in many ways than it was when I was married to Sean. It's very, very different in the material aspect of things.
Andrea always knew that money isn't everything, and now she is happily living her dream without it.
We live in a small house. We drive old used cars. We don't go out to eat. We don't go out to movies. I mean, I don't have extras for anything, but it is a life that is equally as satisfying and equally as fulfilling.
There is an unspoken covenant at the heart of modern society, a fragile agreement that separates order from absolute chaos. We entrust a select few with the immense responsibility of standing between the peaceful progression of daily life and the unpredictable, often violent nature of human conflict. We give these individuals a badge, a uniform, and the authority to enforce the law. In return, we expect them to be the ultimate shield. We expect them to confront the dangers from which the rest of us instinctively flee. But this covenant inherently relies on the assumption that those we ask to step into the line of fire are given the tools necessary to survive it. When that assumption is stripped away, what remains is not just vulnerability, but a profound and systemic failure. This is a story about the devastating consequences of that failure. It is a story about an archaic regulation, a simmering local feud, and a morning that shattered the tranquility of an island territory, forever altering its approach to law enforcement and security. To understand the sheer magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded on the morning of July the 22nd in the year 2010, one must first understand the unique and perilous paradox that defined the American Samoa police force at that time. Across the globe, the image of a law enforcement officer is almost universally accompanied by the presence of a sidearm, a basic and essential tool of self-defense and public protection. However, the legal landscape of American Samoa operated under a vastly different, dangerously outdated paradigm. According to the strict territorial laws governing the region in 2010, standard patrol officers and those assigned to routine security details were explicitly prohibited from carrying firearms on their person while on duty. The reality of this regulation was as stark as it was terrifying. The weapons designated for the police force were not holstered at their hips, ready to be drawn in a split second to neutralize an active threat. Instead, these firearms were securely locked away, heavily restricted, and kept completely out of reach. They were stored in reinforced lockboxes at the central police station or, in some cases, secured inside the trunks of patrol vehicles. Accessing these weapons was not a matter of immediate tactical response, but rather a bureaucratic process that required special authorization and specific orders from higher command. For the men and women wearing the uniform, this meant they were sent out into the world to confront criminals, mediate volatile disputes, and protect the highest institutions of justice armed with nothing more than their bare hands, fundamental riot gear, and the symbolic authority of their badges. They were, by legislative design, rendered entirely defenseless against anyone who chose to disregard the law and arm themselves. The High Court of American Samoa, situated in the central village of Fagatogo, stands as the ultimate symbol of justice and authority within the territory. It is the final arena where the most severe grievances are aired, where evidence is weighed, and where the fates of individuals are decided by the solemn deliberation of a jury. Courthouses, by their very nature, are repositories of human anxiety and conflict. They are places where raw emotions, deeply rooted resentments, and the high stakes of freedom and incarceration collide. On this particular morning in late July, the atmosphere surrounding the Fagatogo courthouse was exceptionally thick with tension. The air was heavy, practically vibrating with the collective apprehension of those gathered inside and outside the building. The source of this intense atmospheric pressure was a highly volatile criminal trial that had reached its absolute climax. The case at hand was not a routine matter of petty theft or minor disturbance. It was a serious criminal proceeding deeply entangled in a bitter, ongoing conflict between rival local families. In closely knit communities where familial ties and clan loyalties dictate social dynamics, legal battles often transcend the individual sitting at the defense table. They become proxy wars for entire families, where pride, reputation, and historical grievances are placed on the public stage. For days, the courthouse had served as the focal point for this simmering animosity, a pressure cooker steadily building steam as the prosecution and defense presented their arguments. The families involved, entrenched in their mutual hostility, waited with bated breath for the judicial system to deliver its final word. Security at the courthouse was understandably paramount, though fundamentally compromised by the territory's restrictive weapons laws. Among those tasked with maintaining order, directing the flow of traffic, and securing the perimeter of the highest court in the land was Police Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. At 36 years of age, Lieutenant Brown was not a novice learning the ropes of law enforcement. He was a seasoned veteran, a deeply respected officer who had dedicated over 10 years of his life to serving and protecting his community. A decade on the force means a decade of navigating the complexities of human behavior, a decade of de-escalating conflicts, and a decade of standing as a pillar of stability in times of crisis. He understood the nuances of the community, the undercurrents of the local family rivalries, and the immense responsibility that came with his rank. Yet, despite his extensive experience, his unwavering dedication, and his senior position, Lieutenant Brown stood outside the courthouse that morning facing the exact same grim reality as every other officer present. Beneath his uniform, he was completely unarmed. Inside the walls of the courtroom, the legal process had finally run its course. The jury, having deliberated on the evidence presented in the case involving the rival families, had reached a conclusion. In a moment that would act as the catalyst for unprecedented violence, the jury delivered a verdict of full acquittal for the defendant. The individual on trial, accused of a serious crime stemming from the ongoing feud, was suddenly and officially cleared of all charges by the highest legal authority in the territory. The gavel fell, the legal proceedings concluded, but the true conflict had only just begun. An acquittal in a courtroom is designed to be the definitive end of a dispute, a peaceful resolution mandated by the state. However, in the eyes of those consumed by vengeance and deeply entrenched in familial warfare, a legal exoneration is often perceived not as justice, but as a profound insult. It is seen as a failure of the system, an unacceptable outcome that demands alternative, extrajudicial correction. The moment the verdict of not guilty echoed through the courthouse, the fragile barrier holding back the accumulated hatred shattered. The tension that had been carefully contained within the structured environment of the legal system immediately boiled over, transforming into an uncontrollable, seething rage that spilled out of the courtroom doors and into the surrounding streets of Fagatogo. The transition from legal resolution to chaotic violence was terrifyingly swift. The acquittal did not bring peace. It ignited a powder keg. While the newly acquitted individual and their supporters may have felt a fleeting sense of vindication, the opposing family felt an immediate, overwhelming demand for retribution. The scales of their internal justice system were completely unbalanced, and the official court had failed to provide the punishment they believed was necessary. In this volatile emotional state, the rule of law completely disintegrates, replaced by the primitive, blinding drive for revenge. It was within this explosive aftermath that the true horror of the morning began to materialize, moving rapidly toward the courthouse steps. The intention to kill had already been formed, driven by the perceived injustice of the jury's decision. The instrument of this vengeance was not a concealed handgun or a makeshift weapon, but a highly lethal, long-range firearm capable of inflicting massive devastation. The perpetrator, consumed by the feud and acting on behalf of the rival family, made a calculated and deliberate decision to bring heavy weaponry to the very doorstep of the justice system. A vehicle approached the immediate vicinity of the High Court, navigating the streets of Fagatogo with a dark, singular purpose. Behind the wheel was Siamo Jr., a man whose familial ties placed him in direct, violent opposition to the individual who had just walked free. The acquittal was the spark, and Siamo Jr. was the resulting explosion. He did not arrive at the courthouse to protest the verdict, to file an appeal, or to voice his grievances through any legitimate channel. He arrived with the explicit, premeditated intention of executing a bloody retaliation. As the vehicle came to a halt right in front of the courthouse gates, the catastrophic flaw in American Samoa's law enforcement protocol was about to be exposed in the most brutal manner imaginable. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, Officer Albert Tiffoli, and the other security personnel were positioned around the building, focused on managing the crowds and maintaining whatever semblance of order remained in the wake of the controversial verdict. They were the designated protectors of the peace, standing on the front line of public safety. Yet, as the doors of the vehicle opened, they were completely oblivious to the fact that they were entirely unequipped to handle the threat that was stepping out onto the pavement. Siamo Jr. emerged from the vehicle, his intentions instantly clear to anyone who saw what he held in his hands. He was armed with a semi-automatic rifle, a weapon engineered for rapid fire, significant range, and maximum kinetic impact. The sheer visual disparity between the heavily armed assailant and the bare-handed police officers created a sickening tableau of impending doom. The officers, bound by the restrictive laws of their government, had their weapons locked away in metal boxes, utterly useless in the face of an immediate, unfolding crisis. They were trapped in a nightmare scenario, transformed in an instant from figures of authority into completely defenseless targets. The presence of the semi-automatic rifle introduced an extreme tactical disadvantage that no amount of bravery, experience, or physical training could overcome. A police officer without a firearm cannot suppress an active shooter. They cannot establish a defensive perimeter, they cannot return fire to protect civilians, and they cannot defend their own lives against high-velocity ammunition. The very concept of law enforcement implies a monopoly on the legitimate use of force to stop violence, but on that July morning, that monopoly was violently seized by a single, vengeful individual holding a rifle. The air around the high court, previously thick with the tension of the trial, suddenly shattered. The transition from the bureaucratic procedures of the justice system to raw, uncontrolled violence was instantaneous. There was no time to call for backup, no time to authorize the retrieval of the locked weapons, and absolutely no time to seek meaningful cover. The officers, including the veteran Lieutenant Brown, were caught completely exposed in the open area in front of the building. The highest court of the territory, a symbol of order and reason, was about to become the backdrop for an unprecedented massacre. The story of what happened next is not just a recounting of a criminal act, but a profound examination of systemic failure and the ultimate sacrifice demanded by a flawed policy. It is a detailed look at how a localized feud managed to strike at the very heart of the territory's justice system, and how the tragic, preventable loss of a dedicated public servant forced an entire government to reevaluate the true cost of leaving its protectors unarmed. The morning of July the 22nd would forever be etched into the history of American Samoa, serving as a dark, bloody dividing line between an era of dangerous naivety and a future forged in the painful lessons of unimaginable loss. To truly comprehend the catastrophic weight of the tragedy that would soon unfold, it is absolutely essential to examine the unique societal landscape of American Samoa and the remarkable character of the man standing at its defense. Fagatogo, the village serving as the seat of government and the home of the territorial high court, is not merely a geographic location, it is the focal point of an incredibly tight-knit, tradition-bound community. In this island territory, the cultural concept of the extended family is the supreme organizing principle of daily life. It is a beautiful, deeply ingrained system of mutual respect, shared responsibility, and unbreakable loyalty. However, this profound interconnectedness possesses a dark and volatile shadow. When disputes arise, they rarely remain confined to the individuals directly involved. Instead, personal arguments can quickly metastasize into fierce, multi-generational feuds between entire familial factions. In such a society, an insult to one is an insult to all, and grievances are held with a gripping intensity. Navigating this complex web of allegiances and simmering resentments is a monumental task for anyone, but for the local law enforcement officers tasked with maintaining the peace, it is a daily walk on a razor's edge. They are not policing a faceless metropolis. They are policing their cousins, their neighbors, and their childhood friends. Standing squarely at this dangerous intersection of law and deeply rooted cultural conflict was Police Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. At 36 years of age, he represented the very best of what the American Samoa police force had to offer. Lieutenant Brown was a highly respected, seasoned veteran who had dedicated more than 10 years of his life to public service. A decade on the force in a small, Insular community is not just a measure of time. It is a testament to immense emotional intelligence, patience, and profound diplomatic skill. He had spent 10 years earning the respect of the very community he patrolled, learning how to defuse explosive situations using nothing but his presence, his voice, and his innate understanding of the people around him. He was known among his peers and the public alike as a calm, steadfast professional, a man who did not let the stress of the badge harden his heart. For Lieutenant Brown, the uniform was not a tool of intimidation. It was a symbol of his unwavering commitment to shielding his community from the chaos that constantly threatened to tear its social fabric apart. Yet, the tragic irony of Lieutenant Brown's career was the staggering vulnerability forced upon him by the very government he was sworn to protect. To be a police officer is to accept that you may have to put your own body between an innocent civilian and a deadly threat. It requires an extraordinary level of courage. But to demand that a human being step into the line of fire without providing them the means to fight back is an entirely different level of sacrifice. The legal framework governing the American Samoa Police Force in the year 2010 was built upon an astonishingly archaic and fatally flawed premise. The laws strictly prohibited standard patrol officers, including those assigned to vital security details at government buildings, from carrying firearms on their person. The rationale behind this policy may have been rooted in a noble, idealistic desire to maintain a demilitarized society, a hope that the absence of guns on police officers would prevent the escalation of violence. But this philosophy created a lethal disparity on the streets. It assumed that criminals, driven by rage or desperation, would respect the unarmed authority of the law. It completely ignored the grim reality that violence does not negotiate with ideals. For Lieutenant Brown and his fellow officers, this restriction was not a theoretical debate. It was a harrowing, everyday reality. Every time they pinned on their badges and stepped out of their homes, they knew they were walking into potentially life-threatening situations entirely defenseless against armed adversaries. Their duty belts carried handcuffs, radios, and batons, tools meant for compliance and communication, but utterly useless against the velocity of a bullet. The firearms allocated to the police force were treated not as essential safety equipment, but as extreme measures to be locked away. These weapons were secured in heavy safes back at the police station or bolted inside the trunks of specific patrol cars. The bureaucratic process required to retrieve these weapons involved requesting permission, receiving authorization from higher command, and physically accessing the lockboxes. In an active shooter scenario, where survival is measured in milliseconds and split-second decisions dictate who lives and who dies, this protocol was practically a death sentence. It meant that in the face of an armed attack, the officers had no suppressive fire, no ability to neutralize the threat, and no way to protect the public or themselves. They were forced to rely solely on the desperate hope that they would never have to face a gun. This agonizing vulnerability was the silent, invisible undercurrent flowing beneath the intense events unfolding in Fagatogo on the morning of July the 22nd. The focal point of the island's anxiety was the High Court building, an imposing structure designed to project the absolute authority of the judicial system. But on that particular morning, the building was struggling to contain a highly volatile criminal trial. This was not a routine case of petty crime. It was a severe legal proceeding that served as a proxy battleground for a vicious, long-standing feud between two prominent rival families. The details of the original assault that led to the charges were merely the spark that had ignited a much larger inferno of hatred. Inside the courtroom, the air was suffocatingly thick with tension. The gallery was packed with members of both families, their faces hardened with anger, transforming the judicial space into a pressure cooker of tribal animosity. The legal process was attempting to impose order and logic upon a deeply emotional conflict driven by vengeance and wounded pride. Everyone present, from the judge down to the spectators, acutely felt the dangerous instability of the situation. Assigned to manage this precarious environment was Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. Alongside Officer Albert Tuffley and a specialized court-martial, Brown was positioned outside the courthouse, tasked with securing the perimeter, controlling the agitated crowds, and maintaining the flow of traffic in front of the building. It was a critical assignment that placed him directly in the crosshairs of the community's fractured emotions. As a veteran officer, he was acutely aware of the shifting dynamics playing out before him. He observed the hostile glares exchanged between family members lingering near the court steps. He understood the profound implications of the trial and knew that whatever verdict the jury delivered, it would almost certainly act as a catalyst for further unrest. The peace of the village hung by a fragile thread, and he was one of the few individuals tasked with keeping that thread from snapping. He stood tall in his uniform, exuding the calm authority he had cultivated over a decade, acting as a visual deterrent to the chaos threatening to erupt. However, despite his vast experience, his sharp situational awareness, and his undeniable bravery, Lieutenant Brown was fundamentally trapped by the systemic failure of his department's policies. He was guarding the highest institution of justice, surrounded by an atmosphere practically vibrating with the promise of violence, yet his physical defense was limited to his own bare hands. He was a seasoned warrior sent into a battlefield without a shield, a dedicated protector left entirely exposed to the worst elements of human nature. As the morning hours ticked by, the agonizing wait for the jury's decision stretched the tension to its absolute breaking point. The rival families paced the grounds, the weight of impending justice pressing down on the courthouse. When the news finally began to ripple through the building that the jury had reached a verdict, a sudden, chilling stillness washed over the area. It was the calm before a catastrophic storm, a brief moment of suspended animation before reality shattered. The verdict was about to be read, and the fragile illusion of control was about to be violently torn away. Outside on the pavement, diligently scanning the crowd and maintaining his post, Lieutenant Lucilla Brown had absolutely no way of knowing that the scales of justice tipping inside the courtroom would trigger an unstoppable wave of vengeance outside. He stood there, unarmed, unprotected, and wholly committed to his duty, completely unaware that a man consumed by familial hatred was already en route, bringing a weapon of war to the steps of the courthouse, and that his 10 years of selfless service were about to violently collide with a fatal loophole in the law. The verdict was read within the hushed, stifling confines of the courtroom, a cold recitation of legal findings that concluded the trial of the accused. The jury had reached a decision of full acquittal. As the words rippled through the packed gallery, the immediate reaction was not one of relief or a return to societal normalcy, but rather a profound, visceral ignition of long-standing fury. For the individuals deeply embedded in the rival family faction, this judicial outcome was not the resolution of a crime. It was an unforgivable victory for their enemies and a total failure of the system to serve what they perceived as proper vengeance. The courtroom, once a sanctuary of orderly procedure, transformed in a heartbeat into a powder keg of seething resentment. Outside, in the sweltering heat of the Fagatogo morning, the reality of this decision began to permeate the atmosphere. The individuals gathered on the courthouse grounds, already operating under the heavy weight of communal pressure and ancestral pride, felt the shift immediately. The legal system had spoken, but the laws of the street, governed by the ironclad rules of tribal loyalty, were demanding a different, more permanent, and blood-soaked reckoning. Lucilla Brown stood at his post, his uniform pressed and his posture radiating the disciplined calm of a man who had navigated years of volatile community tensions. Beside him, Officer Albert Tuffley and the court-martial maintained their positions, performing the routine duties of public safety and traffic control that their role necessitated. They were the visible face of authority, the thin line standing between the potential for disorder and the preservation of the rule of law. Yet, they were fundamentally operating under the restrictive, dangerous constraints of their mandate. They were the sentinels of the court, but they were effectively neutered by the legislative requirement that kept their firearms locked away from their grasp. As the crowd began to stir, sensing the anger emanating from those who felt slighted by the acquittal, Lieutenant Brown remained focused, his eyes scanning the faces and the movements of those around him, attempting to anticipate where the next point of friction might emerge. He had no way of knowing that the true threat was not standing before him in the crowd, but was rapidly approaching from the periphery, a man fueled by the toxic cocktail of familial disgrace and premeditated malice. Siamo Jr. had not come to the courthouse that morning to participate in the democratic process of the law. He had arrived with a singular, calculated intent to bypass the judge, the jury, and the very concept of a legal trial altogether. As he maneuvered his vehicle toward the front of the High Court, he carried with him not just the grievances of his family, but a high-powered, semi-automatic rifle, a weapon that stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the handheld radios and bare hands of the officers on duty. The decision to bring such a devastating implement to a public space, particularly one as sensitive as the seat of the territory's supreme judicial authority, underscored the depth of his commitment to violence. There was no hesitation in his movements, no contemplation of the consequences for the innocent lives he was about to extinguish. He was acting as the executioner for a feud that had clearly moved beyond the reach of mediation or reconciliation. As the vehicle drew closer to the courthouse gates, the scene unfolded with a nightmarish fluidity. Siamo Jr. exited the driver's seat, the rifle already firmly in his grip, his presence immediately disrupting the tense, uneasy equilibrium of the morning. For a split second, the reality of what was happening did not fully register with the crowd, but for the officers on the scene, the recognition was instantaneous and chilling. They saw the weapon, the lethal potential of the rifle, and they knew with devastating clarity that they were absolutely outmatched. Lieutenant Brown, ever the leader, would have recognized the dire tactical disadvantage in that singular, horrific moment. He and his colleagues, tasked with protecting the court, were effectively lambs being led to the slaughter by the very policies that prohibited them from carrying the tools of their profession. There was no perimeter to hold, no cover to seek that could withstand the firepower that Siamo Jr. was about to unleash. The first shots shattered the morning, a series of rapid, echoing cracks that obliterated the fragile peace. The sound was not merely a noise, it was the herald of an unprecedented act of domestic terrorism within the heart of the territory. Siamo Jr. began firing indiscriminately, his target selection clearly focused on the individuals who represented the authority of the state. He didn't just fire, he engaged in a systematic attempt to inflict as much lethality as possible in the shortest amount of time. The officers, caught in the open, were subjected to an impossible situation. They were not combatants in a symmetric engagement. They were defenseless individuals facing the superior force of a semi-automatic weapon. Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, who had spent over a decade protecting the very people who were now running for their lives, found himself facing the ultimate test of his character. He did not turn and flee. Despite having no firearm to return fire, no way to neutralize the assailant, and no means of shielding his body from the high-velocity rounds, he remained present, trying to direct the defense and minimize the carnage. The impact was swift and devastating. Lieutenant Brown was struck, the bullets tearing through his uniform and the life he had built, his body crumpling to the pavement in a sight that would haunt the community for years to come. He died at the scene, a veteran officer who had fulfilled his oath of service with his final breath, sacrificed in a moment of extreme, avoidable vulnerability. Officer Albert Tuffley and the court-martial were also struck, their bodies bearing the terrible weight of the assault, their lives hanging in the balance as the chaos intensified around them. The courtyard became a scene of absolute pandemonium, with spectators, court staff, and civilians caught in the crossfire or scrambling for safety, their cries of terror intermingling with the ongoing, rhythmic pulses of the rifle fire. It was a scene of unmitigated horror, the antithesis of everything the High Court was designed to uphold. The shooter's actions were not merely a crime of passion, they were an assault on the fundamental institutions of American Samoa. By choosing the courthouse as his venue, Siamo Jr. was making a profound statement that the laws were powerless, that the courts were irrelevant, and that the only true authority was the one who held the most firepower. It was an indictment of the state's failure to provide its servants with the means to protect themselves. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the officers, if armed as police in any other part of the world were, might have had a chance to neutralize the threat before the first life was lost. Instead, they were left to deal with a rifle-armed assailant using, at best, their professional training and, at worst, nothing but their courage. In those terrifying moments, The structural deficiencies of the system were laid bare in the most graphic way possible. The silence that followed the initial barrage was filled with the sounds of sirens, the desperate calls for assistance, and the realization that the unthinkable had indeed come to pass. The shooter, having completed his intended act of violence, faced a reality he perhaps had not fully calculated, that he had just committed the most heinous of crimes, one that would lead to his immediate apprehension and a life within the concrete walls of a prison. But that would come later. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on the fallen, a hero who had given everything, and two others who were struggling for their lives, victims of an archaic policy that had finally, bloodily, come home to roost. The tragedy of July the 22nd was etched into the collective memory of every citizen in Fagatogo, a dark chapter that would forever serve as a reminder of the price paid when ideology takes precedence over the safety of those who protect us. As the emergency responders arrived, the contrast between their frantic efforts to save the living and the cold, unyielding finality of the death of Lieutenant Brown underscored the sheer gravity of what had unfolded. The morning had started with a trial, a test of the legal system, but it ended with a far greater, far more permanent lesson for the entire territory. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was a visceral, chaotic blur of sirens, frantic radio calls, and the heavy, suffocating weight of realization that the impossible had indeed occurred at the very threshold of the High Court. While the trauma of the event would linger in the community for years, the initial hours were defined by the rapid, almost mechanical response of law enforcement and medical personnel struggling to regain control of a scene that had been completely surrendered to violence. The perpetrator, Siamo Jr., did not possess the luxury of a prolonged escape. The sheer scale of his actions, the public nature of the execution, the targeting of law enforcement officers, and the blatant disregard for the sanctity of the judicial institution had triggered an instantaneous and overwhelming reaction from the territorial authorities. The site of the crime was secured not because the police were equipped for such a conflict, but because the sheer number of personnel flooding into Fagatogo ensured that the assailant had no path forward. His capture was swift, almost anticlimactic in its speed when compared to the carnage he had unleashed, but the process of holding him accountable was only just beginning to take shape. The investigation that followed was not merely a procedural exercise in gathering evidence, it was an autopsy of a systemic failure. Investigators faced the daunting task of piecing together the timeline of a premeditated murder that had bypassed the security of the island's highest court. Each piece of evidence, the discarded casings, the trajectory of the rounds, the statements of traumatized witnesses, and the weapon itself, served as a damning indictment of the environment that had allowed such an attack to happen. The forensic teams meticulously mapped the scene, documenting the exact positions where Lieutenant Lieutenant Brown and his colleagues had stood when the first shots were fired. These diagrams were not just evidence for a trial. They were maps of a slaughterhouse that had been facilitated by the absence of defensive tools. The detectives working the case were tasked with constructing a narrative that could withstand the scrutiny of a high-profile prosecution, and every detail they uncovered confirmed that this was a cold-blooded, calculated assault. Behind the scenes of the investigation, a profound and painful analysis was taking place within the leadership of the police department and the government. They were forced to reconcile with the harsh reality that their officers had been sitting ducks. Each interview conducted with the survivors, Officer Albert Tuffley and the court-martial who had miraculously survived their injuries, was a reminder of the agony of helplessness. These men, scarred both physically and mentally, recounted the split seconds of the attack with a clarity that was chilling. They spoke of the initial disbelief upon seeing the rifle, the realization that they were outgunned, and the desperate, futile scramble to find safety. Their testimonies were not just crucial for the prosecution. They were the harrowing voices of the victims of a policy that had prioritized an outdated, idealistic vision over the lives of those who served on the front line. The investigators documented these accounts with the seriousness they demanded, knowing that their findings would ultimately force a confrontation with the very laws that had defined the police force for generations. The investigative process also delved deep into the motivation of Siamo Jr. The background of the feud was mapped out, showing the intricate, often invisible threads of resentment that connected the rival families. Detectives spent countless hours detailing the history of the conflict, the previous assault that had led to the initial trial, and the way in which the acquittal had served as a catalyst for the final, violent outburst. This was not a random act of madness. It was a targeted, vengeance-fueled mission. The evidence confirmed that the shooter had carefully planned his arrival at the courthouse to coincide with the conclusion of the legal proceedings. His target was not just the rival family. It was the entire infrastructure of the law that he believed had failed him. The investigation laid bare the reality of a society where private vendettas could so easily intrude upon the public sphere, and where the protective layers intended to shield the innocent were stripped away by the specific constraints of the territory's laws. As the file on the case grew in thickness, it became a comprehensive record of the failure of the institution. The investigative team did not just focus on the actions of the shooter. They inevitably had to document the actions, or the lack thereof, of the security apparatus. They documented the storage protocols for police firearms, the locations of the armories, and the lengthy, restrictive procedures for accessing weapons. Every report filed by the investigators was a quiet, document-based critique of the status quo. The authorities realized that to secure a conviction, they had to tell a story that would resonate with a jury, but in telling that story, they were also telling the story of why their own officers were vulnerable. The tension between the need to prosecute the shooter and the need to rectify the systemic issues was palpable within the prosecutor's office. They understood that the trial would be a public reckoning, not just for the defendant, but for the entire system of governance in American Samoa. Every witness interviewed during the investigative phase, the court staff who had witnessed the horror from the safety of the interior, the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire on the street, and the fellow officers who had arrived to secure the scene, painted a consistent picture of a man who was resolute in his mission. There was no hesitation in his movements, no doubt in his demeanor. The investigation into his background confirmed that he had acquired the firearm with the express intent of using it for lethal purposes. There were no extenuating circumstances that could justify or excuse the execution of a law enforcement officer. The detectives worked tirelessly to ensure that every aspect of the case was airtight, knowing that the defense would look for any opportunity to sow doubt. They meticulously gathered forensic evidence that would leave no room for alternative narratives. The recovered weapon, the ballistics report, and the physical evidence from the crime scene were subjected to rigorous analysis to create an irrefutable link between the shooter and his victims. The investigative process was also a period of mourning and reflection. The detectives were not robots. They were colleagues of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown. They were grieving for a friend, a mentor, and a leader who had been taken from them in the most senseless manner possible. This grief fueled their determination to ensure that the investigation was thorough, precise, and uncompromising. They were building a case that would serve as the final testament to the sacrifice of their fallen brother. Every document, every piece of evidence, and every witness statement was handled with the reverence due to the memory of the man who had died on the courthouse steps. The investigation was the first step in the long, arduous journey toward justice, a journey that would lead directly to the courtroom where the facts of that dark morning would finally be presented to the world, and where the failures that had allowed it to happen would be forced into the blinding light of public scrutiny. The investigators knew that their work was the foundation upon which the future of the police force would be built, and they took that responsibility with the weight it deserved, knowing that they were not just closing a case, but trying to provide some small measure of closure for a community shattered by the violence. As the evidence was compiled and the case prepared for trial, the reality of the impending legal battle loomed over the entire territory, a shadow that would not lift until the final verdict was rendered and the legal system finally had the opportunity to prove its worth. The judicial proceedings following the shooting of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown were destined to be far more than a standard criminal trial. They were a collective, intense public reckoning that forced the territory of American Samoa to confront the depths of its own tragedy within the very walls where it had occurred. The High Court, having served as the epicenter of the initial violence, now became the theater for the state to reclaim its authority and demand a measure of retribution for the life stolen on its doorstep. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere thick with a mixture of grief, righteous anger, and a pervasive, lingering sense of vulnerability that had gripped the populace since that fateful July morning. Every individual present, from the legal teams to the gallery of observers, understood the gravity of the moment. This was not simply a trial about the actions of one man. It was an inquest into the failure of the legal system to protect its own guardians and a test of the community's ability to find closure through the lens of formal law. The prosecution, tasked with the immense responsibility of presenting the case against Cialmo Jr., operated with a meticulous, surgical precision. Their strategy was clear and unwavering, to strip away any potential for emotional deflection or justification by focusing purely on the cold, hard facts of the premeditated execution. They laid out the timeline of that morning with clinical detail, showing how the shooter had arrived with intent, armed with a high-powered semi-automatic rifle that had been acquired for the specific purpose of inflicting lethal harm. The prosecutors skillfully navigated the complex history of the familial feud, not to validate the grievances, but to establish the clear, undeniable motive that had driven the defendant to target the courthouse. They painted a devastating portrait of a man who had decided to reject the outcome of the judicial process, choosing instead to act as judge, jury, and executioner in the middle of a public street. Every witness called to the stand was an embodiment of the trauma that the entire territory had shared. The testimony provided by the survivors, the officers who had been with Lieutenant Brown, was the emotional heartbeat of the trial. Their voices, often trembling with the weight of memory, described the horror of standing unarmed against a man with a rifle. They detailed the disbelief of seeing the muzzle of the weapon, the realization that they had no means of defense, and the heartbreaking moment they saw their colleague fall. These accounts were not just legal testimony. They were a searing indictment of the regulations that had rendered them helpless. The court listened in absolute silence, the weight of their words filling the room and reinforcing the prosecution's argument that this was an act of cold-blooded, premeditated murder against a defenseless public servant. The prosecution ensured that the focus remained on the victims, on the life and dedication of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, to counter any attempts by the defense to frame the act within the context of the clan rivalry. The defense, facing the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution, found itself in an incredibly difficult position. There was no denying that the shooter had committed the act. The forensic evidence, the eyewitness accounts, and the recovery of the weapon created an irrefutable link between the defendant and the crime scene. Instead, the defense team attempted to weave a narrative centered on the intense cultural and psychological pressures of the long-standing family feud. They argued that the defendant had been acting under a state of extreme emotional distress, driven to his breaking point by the perceived failures of the justice system and the intense social pressure of the interfamily conflict. They sought to humanize him, to portray him not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man who had lost his way in a volatile, unforgiving environment. However, this strategy struggled to gain traction in the face of the brutal, calculated nature of the shooting. The sheer lethality of the weapon chosen, the selection of the location, and the direct targeting of the officers made it impossible to dismiss the act as a spontaneous outburst of emotion. Throughout the trial, the judge maintained a firm, authoritative control, ensuring that the legal proceedings remained focused and disciplined. The courthouse, which had seen the violence, now became a place where the order of the law was painstakingly reconstructed. The trial became a mirror, reflecting the deep, structural fractures of the territory back to its citizens. As the defense presented their case, the prosecution was equally relentless in their rebuttal, consistently returning to the central truth that no grievance, regardless of its history or its intensity, could ever justify the execution of an officer of the law. The legal arguments became a battle between the ancient, tradition-bound rules of the clan and the modern, impartial requirements of the criminal code. Each day in the courtroom was a step toward a conclusion that everyone knew was inevitable, yet the process of reaching it was a necessary catharsis for a society struggling to reconcile with its own failures. The closing arguments were a masterclass in legal rhetoric, with both sides making their final appeals to the jury. The prosecution's final statement was a powerful, haunting call for justice, reminding the jurors of the hero who had died protecting them. They emphasized the need for a verdict that would send an unambiguous message that in American Samoa, violence would not be allowed to supersede the rule of law. They spoke of the debt owed to Lieutenant Brown and the necessity of ensuring that his sacrifice would not be in vain. The defense, in their final plea, returned to the themes of human weakness and the overwhelming pressures of the environment, but the emotional resonance of their argument was dwarfed by the sheer horror of the crime itself. The jury, comprised of members of the community who had lived through the fear and the fallout of that day, understood the significance of their duty. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was suspended in a state of intense, breathless anticipation. The announcement of the guilty verdict on all counts, including murder in the first degree, attempted murder, and the unauthorized use of a lethal weapon, was met with a quiet, solemn acceptance. There was no cheering, no outbursts of victory, only a collective acknowledgement that justice, at least in the eyes of the law, had finally been served. The sentencing phase that followed was equally significant. The judge, acknowledging the severity of the crimes and the profound impact on the victim's family and the territorial police force, issued the maximum possible penalty. Siamo Jr. was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was a sentence that reflected the gravity of the violence and the need for the justice system to project an image of absolute, uncompromising strength in the wake of such a tragedy. As the defendant was removed from the courtroom to begin his life behind bars, the silence in the chamber was profound. The trial had concluded, but the resonance of the proceedings would be felt for generations. The case had served as a mirror, a public audit of a society's highest ideals and its lowest realities. It had provided the victims' families with the only form of closure that the state could offer, but it had also, more importantly, prepared the ground for the sweeping changes that were to follow. The verdict was not just an end, it was the final, necessary catalyst for the transformation of the American Samoa police force. By condemning the actions of the shooter and upholding the sanctity of the officers, the court had cleared the way for a new chapter in the history of the territory, one where the protectors would no longer be sent into the darkness without the shield of their duty. The trial had done its job. It had identified the culprit, it had punished the crime, and it had fundamentally altered the conversation about what it truly means to enforce the law in a community defined by both its traditions and its need for safety. The echoes of the gunfire that once shattered the morning in Fagatogo have long since faded, yet the scar that the death of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown left upon the psyche of American Samoa remains as indelible as the names etched into the granite of memorials far beyond the island's shores. The tragedy was not merely a singular moment of violence, it was a societal earthquake that fundamentally shifted the tectonic plates of the territory's justice and security infrastructure. The legacy of July 22, 2010, is a complex, sobering narrative of loss, systemic evolution, and the agonizingly high price of transition. In the quiet aftermath of the legal proceedings, as the prison gates closed on Siamo Jr., the territory was left to reckon with a hollow space where a husband, a father, and a dedicated public servant had once stood. The validation of his heroism, marked by the inclusion of his name on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C., served as a powerful, national recognition of his sacrifice, yet for the community of American Samoa, the loss was intimate and irrecoverable. The most profound legacy of Lieutenant Brown's death was the complete and irrevocable dismantling of the policy that had rendered the island's police force defenseless. For years, the law had dictated an idealistic, yet ultimately dangerous, mandate that kept officers unarmed. The tragedy exposed the lethal naivety of this approach with undeniable, heart-wrenching clarity. In the wake of the shooting, the public outcry was not merely a reaction to a murder, it was a fierce, unified demand for a modern approach to public safety. The government, under immense pressure from both the populace and a mourning, outraged police department, was forced to confront the reality that they had been gambling with the lives of their protectors. The legislative process that followed was swift by necessity, driven by the realization that to continue the old way was to invite further bloodshed. The laws were amended, the old restrictions were peeled away, and a new era of police training and standard equipment was inaugurated. This transformation was not merely about handing out weapons. It was a fundamental shift in the tactical doctrine of the entire territory. The The police were mandated to undergo rigorous, professional training, learning not just how to handle firearms, but how to deploy them within a legal and ethical framework that prioritized the preservation of life. This was a challenging evolution for a community that had historically relied on non-confrontational methods, but it was a bridge that had to be crossed. The sight of a patrol officer carrying a sidearm became the new standard, a visual manifestation of a government finally taking responsibility for the safety of its personnel. This change was the direct, hard-won fruit of Lieutenant Brown's ultimate sacrifice. His life, and the way it was taken, had become the catalyst that forced a long-overdue maturation of the security apparatus. It was a painful, expensive transformation, but one that ensured no officer in the future would have to face the same impossibility that Brown had endured. Reflecting on the deeper implications of the tragedy, it becomes clear that the case of the High Court shooting served as a mirror for the entire territory. It forced a confrontation between the traditional, close-knit values of clan loyalty and the universal, objective requirements of the law. The feud that had precipitated the violence was an artifact of an older time, a way of settling disputes that was increasingly incompatible with the demands of a modern society. The tragedy compelled a necessary, albeit difficult, public conversation about the nature of justice and the danger of allowing private grievances to bleed into public life. It demonstrated that when the rule of law is perceived as weak or ineffective, individuals are more likely to seek their own violent solutions. By strengthening the police and upholding the integrity of the courts, the territory was taking a definitive step toward insulating its future from the reach of such ancestral hatreds. The personal cost of this transition, however, cannot be measured in legislative updates or improved training protocols. It is measured in the lives of the families who survived the loss and the colleagues who have to continue their duty with the memory of that morning burned into their minds. The memorialization of Lucilla Brown was a way for the community to reclaim his story from the senseless violence of his death and to transform it into a narrative of service and courage. His name, inscribed alongside others who fell in the line of duty, serves as a permanent, immovable sentinel against forgetting. It reminds every officer who steps into the uniform that they are part of a lineage, a brotherhood and sisterhood of sacrifice that transcends the borders of the territory and links them to a global history of law enforcement. As the years pass, the specific details of that July morning, the sounds of the rifle fire, the panic on the courthouse steps, and the sudden, jarring cessation of a life dedicated to service, may slowly fade into the background of history, but the lesson that was forged in blood remains. The tragedy underscored a fundamental truth that holds for every society, regardless of its location or its traditions, that the protection of the community is a responsibility that cannot be fulfilled through ideals alone. It requires the commitment of the state to provide its guardians with the tools, the support, and the authority necessary to perform their duty safely and effectively. The death of Lucilla Brown was the price paid for this realization. It was a profound, unnecessary, and devastating loss that reshaped the future of American Samoa. Ultimately, the story of this tragedy is one of an institution catching up to the realities of a dangerous world. It is a story about the resilience of a community that, despite being shattered by an act of unprecedented violence, managed to pull itself together and commit to a more secure future. The legacy of the courthouse shooting is not just the memory of a fallen officer, but the emergence of a force that is now better equipped to defend itself and, in doing so, better equipped to defend the public it serves. It stands as a testament to the fact that progress is often bought at the highest possible price, and that the duty to learn from the past is the greatest tribute that can be paid to those who are lost in its darker chapters. As the sun sets over Fagatogo today, the silence is no longer the fearful, heavy stillness of a place waiting for the next eruption of tribal violence, but a more tranquil, secure environment where the institutions of justice can operate with the protection they require. The shift was agonizing, the path was paved with grief, but the resolution was a necessary, historic step forward for the territory. The name of Lucilla Brown remains the cornerstone of this legacy, a symbol of the courage it takes to protect the peace and the heavy responsibility the state must carry to ensure its defenders never stand alone in the face of danger. In the end, his life was not defined by how he died, but by the fact that his death became the catalyst for a safer, more resilient society, a legacy that will continue to influence the territory for as long as there is an officer standing on the front line to protect the rule of law and the lives of those who live under its guidance. The story of this tragedy remains a guiding, albeit somber, light, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never again repeated in the future. The aftermath of such a profound historical disruption is never truly settled. It evolves, echoing through the corridors of time as the territory attempts to reconcile its traditional soul with the stark realities of modern governance. For American Samoa, the path forward after the tragic loss of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown was paved with a solemn, collective resolve that transcended the initial mourning. As the years have unfolded since the events of July 2010, the territory has navigated the complex process of institutional reform, constantly balancing the preservation of its unique cultural identity with the uncompromising necessities of public safety. The reform was not merely a legislative adjustment, it was a psychological shift, a departure from an era of enforced innocence into a more mature, guarded reality. This transformation remains a defining element of the modern American Samoan experience, serving as a silent but omnipresent backdrop to the everyday work of its law enforcement agencies. Every patrol, every court security shift, and every interaction between the police and the public is now influenced, in ways both subtle and overt, by the lessons learned on those blood-stained steps in Fagatogo. One must consider the enduring impact on the families who were at the center of the original, volatile feud. The violence of that day did not resolve the animosities. It only served to highlight the devastating consequences of failing to temper tribal fervor with the impartial logic of the law. In the years following the trial, there has been a concerted effort by community leaders and government officials to foster a greater emphasis on conflict resolution and civic mediation. The tragedy acted as a severe warning against the uncontrolled expression of family pride through extrajudicial means. While it would be naive to suggest that deep-seated cultural tensions have been entirely eradicated, the memory of the shooting serves as a powerful deterrent. The community is acutely aware of the cost of crossing the line from grievance to violence, and this awareness has fundamentally altered the discourse within the villages. The court, once seen as a battlefield for proxy wars, now stands as a more reinforced bastion of legal authority, where the weight of the law is felt more significantly and respected more deeply. The police force itself has undergone a maturation that is visible in every aspect of its operations. The shift from an unarmed patrol model to one where officers are properly equipped and trained is not just a change in gear, it is a change in the professional identity of the men and women who serve. They are now viewed by the public and by themselves as legitimate protectors who possess the means to engage with the realities of modern crime. This shift has fostered a higher level of professional confidence among the ranks, a necessary component for effective law enforcement in any part of the world. The rigorous training programs implemented post-tragedy have created a generation of officers who are not only capable of handling firearms, but are also deeply schooled in the ethics of their usage, the sanctity of life, and the immense responsibility of holding the power of lethal force. They carry the legacy of Lucilla Brown with them, not as a burden of vulnerability, but as a standard of service to be upheld. Furthermore, the judiciary in American Samoa has adopted a more fortified posture, recognizing that their institution is a critical target that requires constant vigilance. The security protocols that were once seen as bureaucratic formalities have been transformed into robust, active systems of protection. The courthouse is no longer just a place of deliberation. It is a secured facility, managed with an awareness that the peace of the territory depends on the safety of its legal proceedings. This commitment to security reflects a broader realization that the authority of the law is only as strong as the ability of the state to protect the venues where it is exercised. The judge, the jurors, and the court staff now work in an environment that acknowledges the inherent risks of their roles, allowing them to focus on the administration of justice without the paralyzing fear of uncontrolled external interference. The story of the Fagatogo shooting has also transcended its territorial origins, becoming a cautionary tale studied by other small jurisdictions across the Pacific and beyond. It serves as a compelling case study on the dangers of legislative inertia and the importance of maintaining an agile, modern approach to public safety. International observers and legal experts have analyzed the American Samoan experience to understand how small, tradition-heavy societies can successfully transition to modern policing standards without losing their unique cultural character. The narrative of the tragedy and the subsequent path to reform provides a roadmap for others navigating similar challenges, proving that institutional change is possible when a community is confronted with the undeniable truth of its vulnerabilities. It is a testament to the resilience of the American Samoan people that they took a moment of absolute horror and used it as the foundation for a more stable and secure future. In the broader context of the American national landscape, the sacrifice of Lieutenant Brown has been woven into the fabric of the country's collective memory. The inclusion of his name in national memorials is not just a gesture of respect. It is an acknowledgement that his life and his service were of significant value to the entire nation. It bridges the distance between the remote island territory and the central seat of government in Washington, affirming that the lives of those who protect the law in the Pacific are just as precious as those in the largest cities of the mainland. This connection provides a sense of solidarity that is vital for the morale of the local police, who now know that their work is recognized, valued, and honored on a national stage. It reinforces the idea that they are part of a larger, dedicated community of public servants, all working toward the same goal of protecting the public from the dangers of the world. As we look toward the future, the legacy of this tragedy continues to evolve, serving as a reminder that the covenant between the state and its protectors must be maintained with vigilance and care. The safety of the people depends on the ability of the state to support its guardians, and the tragedy of July 22nd stands as the ultimate, heartbreaking evidence of what happens when that support is absent. It is a story that will likely be told for generations, passed down through the ranks of the police force as a fundamental lesson in the reality of their profession. It is a story that reminds us of the fragility of peace and the immense effort required to uphold it in the face of human volatility. In conclusion, the path from that morning of chaos to the relative stability of today was not short, nor was it easy. It was a journey marked by the tears of a family, the outrage of a community, and the determined, methodical efforts of a government trying to rectify its past mistakes. The legacy of Lucilla Brown is a living, breathing testament to the power of sacrifice to drive necessary change. It is a story that transcends its tragic beginning to become a chronicle of institutional progress and communal resilience. While the void left by his death will always be felt, the transformation that his loss catalyzed has undoubtedly saved lives that might otherwise have been lost to similar failures. The territory is a safer place because of the lessons forced upon it by that dark day. The memory of the officer who stood unarmed in the face of an impossible threat has become the inspiration for a force that now stands ready, equipped, and dedicated to the mission of ensuring that the law, and those who protect it, will always be the final, unyielding line of defense against the chaos of the world. This is the ultimate, enduring tribute to his life, his duty, and the sacrifice he made for the community he loved. The echoes of Fagatogo are now the quiet, steady rhythm of a territory that has learned the hard way that the best way to honor the fallen is to ensure the safety of those who continue to walk the line in their stead, moving forward with the wisdom of the past and the unwavering commitment to a safer tomorrow for all. The final chapter of this narrative is not one of completion, but rather one of perpetual continuity. To reflect on the tragedy of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown is to acknowledge that the work of maintaining a just society is a never-ending endeavor that requires constant vigilance, self-reflection, and the courage to evolve. As the years have compounded into over a decade since the morning of July the 22nd in 2010, the memory of that day has become institutionalized within the soul of American Samoa. It has transcended the initial, raw trauma to become a cornerstone of the professional identity of the territorial police. Every new recruit who enters the academy is introduced to the story, not as a grim curiosity, but as a fundamental lesson in the reality of their profession and the weight of the oath they are taking. They learn that their duty is not an abstract concept, but a tangible commitment that can demand the ultimate sacrifice at any moment. This institutional memory is the most powerful tool for ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated, creating a safeguard that exists within the minds and hearts of the officers themselves. Looking back, the evolution of the law enforcement apparatus from an unarmed, defensive force to one equipped with the necessary tools for protection serves as a model of how systemic failure can be corrected through tragedy-induced transformation. This was not a change that happened overnight, nor was it without its critics and challenges. The transition involved intense debate, significant budgetary considerations, and a delicate navigation of local culture, yet the necessity of the reform remained undeniable. The case of the High Court shooting served as the definitive, unarguable justification for this shift. It silenced the arguments that clung to an archaic, idealistic vision of policing and replaced them with the pragmatic reality that an unprotected officer is a casualty in the making. The territory proved that it had the capacity to learn from its most painful moments and to emerge on the other side with a structure that is more resilient, more professional, and more capable of fulfilling its vital role in the community. The broader impact on the societal fabric of American Samoa is equally profound. The public's perception of the police has evolved alongside the department's transformation. There is a newfound recognition of the inherent dangers that officers face and a more sophisticated understanding of the role that a strong, properly equipped force plays in the stability of the territory. The community has seen, through the lens of history, that the alternative to a functioning, respected police force is not a demilitarized utopia, but a space where violence can easily escalate when the rule of law is not adequately defended. This collective awareness has contributed to a more stable environment where the judiciary can operate without the shadow of immediate physical threat looming over its proceedings. The court remains the final arbiter of disputes, and it is now supported by a security apparatus that commands the respect necessary to maintain the sanctity of the legal process. As we consider the global landscape of law enforcement, the lessons learned in Fagatogo are highly relevant to other regions that prioritize tradition and social cohesion. The American Samoan experience highlights the importance of maintaining an agile policy that can adapt to the changing nature of threats. It serves as a reminder that the institutions tasked with protecting the public must be supported by the state, not just in principle but in practice. When governments fail to provide their protectors with the basic tools of their trade, they are failing the entire community. The tragedy of Lieutenant Brown remains a haunting, graphic illustration of this failure, one that should be required study for any jurisdiction that finds itself questioning the need for modern security measures. It is a cautionary tale that underscores the necessity of constant institutional evaluation and the danger of allowing policy to become decoupled from reality. The legacy of the victim himself, Lucilla Brown, continues to serve as a beacon of dedication. He was not just a symbol. He was a man who performed his duty with quiet excellence and unwavering commitment. His life and his sacrifice have inspired a generation of officers to strive for a similar standard of professional integrity. The memorials and tributes are, in their own way, an expression of the community's enduring gratitude for his service. However, the true tribute to his life is the fact that his death forced the territory to become a safer place for all its citizens. His legacy is etched into the training manuals, the duty protocols, and the very mindset of the police force. He is remembered as a protector who did not yield, and his memory provides the foundation upon which a more professional and better-equipped police department now stands. His story is one of service, and the outcome of that service has fundamentally changed the history of the territory. In considering the future, we must acknowledge that the risks associated with law enforcement are dynamic and ever-changing. The era of the single, premeditated shooting at the courthouse has given way to new, more complex challenges that the territory will have to navigate with the same resolve it demonstrated after 2010. The lesson of the past is that the approach to these challenges must be proactive, informed by data and experience, and always centered on the safety of the public and those tasked with its protection. The territory's ability to remain stable in the face of future crises will depend on its capacity to remember the lessons of the past while remaining open to the innovations of the future. The resilience of the American Samoan people has been tested in the fires of tragedy and has proven to be an unbreakable strength. They have emerged from their darkest moments with a renewed commitment to the principles of justice and the security of their community. Ultimately, the story of the shooting at the High Court is a narrative about the human capacity for growth and adaptation in the face of insurmountable loss. It is a testament to the fact that societies, like individuals, can be forged anew through the crucible of trauma. The tragedy did not break the territory. It forced it to grow, to mature, and to take responsibility for its own safety in a way that it never had before. This is the enduring significance of the events that transpired on that July morning. It is a story that will continue to resonate as long as there is a need to uphold the law, and as long as there are individuals willing to stand in the gap between peace and chaos. The name of Lucilla Brown will always be linked to this evolution, a name that represents the highest ideals of service and the terrible, heavy cost of ensuring that the rule of law remains the final authority in our lives. As the years continue to pass, the narrative will remain a guiding light, ensuring that the community never forgets the importance of its protectors and the fragility of the peace they work so hard to maintain. The territory has moved forward, bolstered by the wisdom born of tragedy, and it stands as a testament to the power of a community to redefine its future after the most challenging of times. The legacy of Fagatogo is a lasting, permanent foundation of strength, ensuring that the path ahead is built on the hard-won experience of the past, and that the sacrifice of a few leads to the greater safety and stability of all. The final reflection on this story must be one of solemn gratitude for those who protect us, and a deep, abiding commitment to ensuring they are never again left to face the darkness alone. This is the vow that the territory made to its fallen officer, and it is a vow that continues to be honored with every passing day, as the police and the public move forward in a relationship defined by trust, protection, and the shared understanding that the peace they enjoy is the result of a dedication that knows no bounds, even when faced with the most formidable of challenges to the rule of law. The enduring narrative of the Fagatogo tragedy is ultimately a reflection on the fragile, evolving nature of justice in a society that cherishes both its deep-rooted traditional customs and its necessity for modern order. As we contemplate the journey American Samoa has undertaken since July 22, 2010, it becomes evident that the lessons learned from the death of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown extend far beyond the borders of the territory. The transformation of the police department from a force restricted by archaic, idealistic limitations into a modernized, effectively equipped agency is a testament to the power of a community to confront its failures head-on. This evolution was not a simple administrative pivot. It was a profound, multi-year shift in the collective consciousness of the islands. It required a complete restructuring of the pedagogical approach to law enforcement, moving away from a reliance on the symbolic nature of the badge and toward a comprehensive framework that prioritizes the tactical readiness of the individual officer. The transition was arduous, often marked by the friction between those who clung to the memory of an idealized, unarmed past and those who recognized that the world had changed, rendering the old ways not only obsolete but lethal. One must delve deeper into the psychological metamorphosis of the rank-and-file officers who have served in the wake of the shooting. For those who were on the front lines during the event, the aftermath was a period of intense trauma and reflection, a time where they had to reconcile their professional duty with the harrowing realization of their own helplessness. The new generation of officers, however, enters the force with a different orientation. They are trained in an environment where the existence of a sidearm is not a contradiction of their authority, but an essential component of their responsibility to survive and protect. This shift has not diminished the importance of their role as community mediators. Rather, it has provided them with the security to operate effectively in a landscape where volatile disputes are always a possibility. The legacy of the tragedy has been distilled into an ethos of preparedness, where the officer is no longer a symbolic figure of order, but a functional, capable defender of the peace who understands that their ability to protect others is inextricably linked to their ability to defend themselves. The impact of this case on the judiciary has been similarly transformative. The High Court, having been the site of such a devastating collapse of security, has since integrated these hard-learned lessons into its operational culture. The administration of justice is now understood to be inseparable from the administration of safety. The proceedings that occur within the courthouse are protected by a perimeter that is no longer merely decorative or symbolic. This shift reflects a more mature understanding of the role of the state in maintaining the sanctity of its legal forums. The judiciary acts with a greater degree of confidence, knowing that the structural failures that allowed the tragedy to occur have been mitigated by intentional, systemic reform. This is the ultimate purpose of legal history, to ensure that the mistakes of the past become the safeguards of the future. The trial of Siamo Jr. stands as an indelible marker of this transition, a reminder of the time when the system was brittle and a testament to its current, more resilient form. The community's response to the ongoing legacy of the event also deserves recognition. In the years following the shooting, the families, the neighbors, and the broader citizenry of American Samoa have had to reckon with the reality that their close-knit traditions, while beautiful and foundational, can also be the source of dangerous instability when left unchecked by the requirements of the rule of law. The tragic loss of Lieutenant Brown has acted as a catalyst for a more nuanced dialogue about the intersection of cultural loyalty and civic duty. It has forced a community to ask difficult questions about the nature of vengeance and the cost of allowing personal or familial grievances to escalate into public violence. This dialogue is, in itself, a form of progress. It indicates a society that is not merely reactive to the pressures of its environment, but one that is actively working to shape its own norms and values in a way that prioritizes the safety and stability of all its members. From an institutional perspective, the commitment to honoring the fallen officer has evolved from public expressions of grief to a deeper, more permanent integration into the fabric of the police department. The memory of Lucilla Brown is not relegated to a commemorative plaque. It is alive in the standards of training, in the operational protocols, and in the way the force interacts with the community. His name serves as a benchmark for professional integrity and for the courage required to fulfill the duty of a protector. The international recognition of his sacrifice, through his inclusion in the national memorials of the United States, has provided a sense of pride and professional validation for the local force. It underscores that their mission is significant, that their lives have inherent value, and that their service is recognized by a global fraternity of law enforcement professionals. This connectivity is vital for the continued development of the force, as it encourages the adoption of international best practices while acknowledging the unique cultural context in which they must be applied. Looking toward the future, the resilience shown by the people of American Samoa suggests that they are well-equipped to navigate the challenges that lie ahead. The tragedy was a crucible that tested the core of their society, and they emerged not by denying the past, but by integrating its lessons into a more robust and realistic future. The evolution of the police, the fortification of the courts, and the shift in public discourse are all indicators of a community that has learned to value the rule of law as the bedrock of its security. The shadow of July 22nd will always persist, as it should, for it is a reminder of the fragility of the peace that we so often take for granted. Yet, it is a shadow that no longer defines the territory, but rather serves as a dark reference point, a baseline against which to measure how far the society has come in its commitment to protecting the protectors. The narrative of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown is, at its core, a story about the resilience of the human spirit when faced with the absolute worst of human nature. It is a story that emphasizes that our institutions are not stagnant entities, but living systems that must grow and respond to the lessons we learn through struggle and loss. The progress made in American Samoa is a beacon for other small communities that find themselves grappling with the balance of tradition and modernity, demonstrating that it is possible to modernize in the face of crisis without sacrificing the unique character of one's culture. The legacy of the Fagatogo shooting is an enduring, solemn commitment to the idea that the law is not an abstraction, but a living, breathing force that requires the vigilance, the preparation, and the sacrifice of those dedicated to its maintenance. As the territory moves forward, it does so with the wisdom that only true experience can provide, knowing that the best way to honor the past is to continue the work of building a safer, more stable future for all. This is the final, ultimate conclusion of the story, a testament to the endurance of the community and the lasting significance of the life and sacrifice of a man who stood, in his final moments, as the guardian of the law in a time and place that had yet to learn the true cost of leaving its protectors exposed to the elements of chaos. The memory of his service is the foundation of the current order, a foundation built upon the hard-won realization that true peace is not merely the absence of violence, but the presence of a robust, prepared, and deeply committed defense of the values that define a civilized society. As the future unfolds, the memory of July 22nd will serve as a permanent, guiding and cautionary beacon, ensuring that the progress of the territory remains firmly anchored in the lessons of its history, and that the protection of those who serve the public remains the highest, most sacred obligation of the state. The finality of this chronicle brings us to a place of profound reflection, standing at the intersection of where history becomes memory and memory becomes the foundation for future governance. The tragedy in Fagatogo has etched itself into the bedrock of American Samoan identity, not merely as a record of a dark day in the year 2010, but as a perpetual lighthouse warning against the dangers of stagnation. As we close the account on the life and sacrifice of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown, we are reminded that the evolution of any justice system is often bought with the currency of extreme suffering. The transformation of the territorial police into a force that is now fully equipped, professionally trained, and psychologically prepared for the realities of modern crime is not just a triumph of policy. It is a manifestation of the collective will of a people who decided that they would no longer allow their protectors to be vulnerable. This journey from the archaic to the modern was a necessity born of the most painful circumstances, and it represents a permanent change in how the territory views the covenant between the state and the individuals who enforce its laws. The legacy of the shooting has fundamentally altered the discourse surrounding public safety within the islands. It has moved the conversation from a place of idealistic hope to one of pragmatic, grounded responsibility. The community now recognizes that the sanctity of their institutions, the courts, the schools, and the public gathering places, relies on a security presence that is both capable and visible. This is not to say that the territory has abandoned its traditions or its deep commitment to family and clan. Rather, it has learned that these cultural values can best flourish when the rule of law provides a stable, secure framework in which they can operate. The integration of modern policing standards has not erased the local identity, it has fortified it, ensuring that the unique cultural fabric of American Samoa is protected from the corrosive influence of lawlessness. The trial of the assailant served as the closure of a legal chapter, but the true, ongoing resolution is found in the everyday acts of service performed by officers who now possess the means to safely navigate the complexities of their duties. Consider the ripple effects of this story as it travels beyond the shores of the territory. It serves as a vital case study for the global law enforcement community, illustrating the inherent risks when policy dictates that protectors must remain unarmed. The tragedy in Fagatogo is a sharp, indelible reminder that the fundamental duty of the state is to ensure that those who stand between the public and danger are given the necessary resources to perform their function. The story of Lucilla Brown resonates because it speaks to a universal truth, that the duty of care between the government and its servants is a sacred trust that cannot be neglected. When that trust is broken by bureaucratic inertia, the consequences are always measured in human life. By documenting this, by analyzing the systemic failures, and by celebrating the ultimate reform, American Samoa has contributed a vital chapter to the worldwide study of police evolution and the crucial importance of maintaining an agile, modern approach to the maintenance of order. Furthermore, the endurance of this narrative provides a sense of continuity for the local police force. New officers, who were mere children when the tragedy occurred, grow into their roles with the knowledge of what happened on those courthouse steps. This is not intended to cultivate fear, but to foster a deep sense of professional identity. They understand that their equipment, their training, and their protocols are not mere administrative details. They are the result of a hard-won lesson that was paid for by the life of a predecessor. This knowledge instills a sense of responsibility that transcends the day-to-day work, connecting each officer to a lineage of service that is defined by both the triumphs and the tragedies of the past. It is this sense of history that gives the department its strength and its resolve, ensuring that the mistakes of the previous era are never revisited upon the current generation. The judicial institution in Fagatogo stands today as a testament to the fact that security is an active, ongoing effort. The fortification of the courthouse, the heightened awareness of court staff, and the professional coordination between the judicial branch and the law enforcement agencies are all signs of a system that has internalized the lessons of its own vulnerability. The courtroom is once again a place where justice is administered, but it is now a place where the participants operate with a clear understanding that the process is protected. This stability is the true resolution of the tragedy. It allows the legal system to focus entirely on its primary function, the pursuit of justice, without the debilitating distraction of potential, unmitigated threats. The transition from the chaos of 2010 to the structured security of today is perhaps the most significant, if quiet, achievement of the entire process of reform. As we look toward the horizon of the future, we must recognize that the nature of threats to public order will continue to change, requiring an equally adaptive and vigilant response. The territory of American Samoa has proven its capacity for adaptation and resilience, and these traits will be the primary assets in navigating the challenges of the coming decades. The memory of the sacrifice made by Lucilla Brown will remain a touchstone for this future, a reminder of the price of failure and the necessity of constant improvement. The society has moved forward with a clear-eyed view of both its strengths and its limitations, and this maturity is what will sustain it in the face of future uncertainties. The commitment to the rule of law is now deeply rooted, supported by a system that understands the value of the individuals who stand on the front lines to defend it. In the final assessment, the story of the High Court shooting is one of human resilience triumphing over the most challenging of circumstances. It is a chronicle of a community that was shaken to its core but refused to be broken. It is a tribute to a fallen officer whose memory has become the bedrock of a new era of security, and it is a testament to the capacity of institutions to learn, to grow, and to become more than they were in the wake of disaster. The transformation has been profound, and the benefits are measured in the lives of the citizens who now enjoy a more stable, secure environment. As this chronicle concludes, it does so with the understanding that the legacy of those events is not found in the pain of the past, but in the enduring strength of the present and the unwavering commitment to a safer, more resilient future. The territory of American Samoa has emerged from the crucible of tragedy with a renewed sense of purpose, a strengthened commitment to its own institutions, and an eternal, deep respect for those who take up the mantle of protection. This is the ultimate, enduring resolution, ensuring that the name of Lucilla Brown will always be synonymous with the highest ideals of service and the collective resolve of a people who have learned that the best way to honor the past is to build a future that is worthy of the sacrifice of those who gave everything in the line of duty. The story ends here, but the legacy continues, woven into the very fabric of the territory, serving as a silent, constant reminder of the vigilance that is the price of our collective peace and the profound, shared responsibility we all hold for the safety of those who stand for justice in the face of chaos. As the sun rises over Fagatogo, it illuminates a community that has found its path through the darkness, moving forward with the wisdom of its history and the unwavering, collective dedication to a future defined by order, safety, and the enduring honor of those who served. The path toward the future of American Samoa's security infrastructure is not a destination at which one arrives and rests, but a continuous journey of maintenance and refinement that honors the heavy costs of yesterday while preparing for the unpredictable nature of tomorrow. As we reflect on the decade and a half that has passed since the tragedy in Fagatogo, it becomes increasingly clear that the death of Lieutenant Lucilla Brown was not just a singular event in the annals of the territory's history, but the catalyst for a fundamental restructuring of the social contract between the government and its people. This contract, once fragile and reliant on outdated, idealistic notions of non-confrontational authority, has been rewritten in the wake of the blood spilled on the courthouse steps. The transformation of the law enforcement department into a modern, disciplined, and appropriately equipped entity is the most visible manifestation of this change, Yet the deeper shift lies in the collective mindset of a community that has learned that the rule of law is an active, defensive position, not a passive ideal. Every day that passes with the law upheld and with the justice system functioning in safety is a quiet tribute to the memory of the officer who gave his life to protect that very stability. The pedagogical evolution within the police academy has been equally significant in ensuring that the lessons of July 2010 are never forgotten. New recruits are taught that their profession is not defined by the badge they wear, but by the readiness they maintain. They undergo rigorous training that simulates the complexities of the environment in which they will serve, emphasizing the necessity of being prepared for the worst-case scenario. This professionalization has fostered a culture of excellence and accountability, where the officer is both a protector of the people and a guardian of the institution. They are instructed in the nuances of de-escalation, legal protocols, and the ethical application of force, all within a framework that acknowledges the reality that they must be capable of defending themselves to defend others. This holistic approach to training is the direct inheritance of the failure that left Lieutenant Brown defenseless, and it ensures that the territorial police are no longer a reactive force, but a proactive one that anticipates challenges before they manifest as crises. Furthermore, the relationship between the judiciary and the law enforcement agencies has been solidified into a symbiotic partnership that prioritizes security at every level of the legal process. The courts are no longer merely administrative centers. They are understood as high-value targets that require specialized protection. This integration has resulted in a robust security architecture that includes controlled access, constant surveillance, and rapid response capabilities, all of which contribute to an environment where the law can be administered without fear. This systemic resilience is the true legacy of the trial of Siamo Jr., which showed that even in the face of the most heinous crimes, the legal system possesses the capacity to function and reach a definitive resolution. The stability of the current judicial process is the hard-won result of a community's determination to never again allow its courts to be held hostage by the violent whims of an armed assailant. The societal conversation regarding familial feuds and the role of traditional loyalties in the context of the law has also evolved in a healthy, albeit difficult, direction. The tragedy forced a confrontation with the reality that the pursuit of personal or familial vendettas, when taken into the public sphere, leads to nothing but catastrophe. While the culture of American Samoa continues to cherish its bonds of kinship, there is now a clearer boundary between the private resolution of family matters and the absolute requirement to respect the territorial rule of law. This nuanced understanding is a mark of a maturing society that can value its roots while protecting its future. The narrative of the Fagatogo shooting has become a standard reference point in this dialogue, serving as the ultimate cautionary example of the chaos that follows when tribal impulses are prioritized over the institutional order. This cultural shift, while perhaps less tangible than a new set of police regulations, is arguably the most vital element in securing the long-term stability of the islands. In the broader context of the American Pacific, the experience of American Samoa provides a valuable perspective on the necessity of local governance to address its own unique security challenges. By taking ownership of the reforms required after the shooting, the territory demonstrated a degree of self-reliance and civic maturity that is exemplary. The process was not handed down from an external power but was conceived, debated, and implemented by the people and the government who had lived through the trauma. This grassroots approach to reform ensured that the solutions were tailored to the specific context of the culture and the needs of the community, making them more durable and more widely accepted. It serves as a model for other small, insular jurisdictions that must balance the preservation of tradition with the modernization of their state institutions. The lesson is that when a community faces its demons directly, it has the power to transform them into the safeguards of a new, stronger reality. As we look at the legacy of Lucilla Brown today, it is clear that his name has transcended the personal identity of the man himself to become a symbol of the entire territory's transition. He is remembered as the individual whose sacrifice made the protection of others a priority, a martyr for the cause of a more secure and just society. The memorials that bear his name, both within the islands and on the national level, are physical manifestations of a communal commitment to never allow his service to be forgotten. But the most significant memorial is the current, fully operational, and professional police force that stands ready to serve. His spirit lives on in the professionalism of every officer, in the security of every court proceeding, and in the peace that the citizens of American Samoa enjoy every day. He is the guardian of their safety, not because he is present, but because the systemic changes that his death necessitated continue to protect them in his absence. The final consideration in this historical overview must be the enduring fragility of peace. It is a state that must be nurtured, protected, and defended against the ever-present threat of human volatility. The tragedy of Fagatogo was a reminder of this, a jarring wake-up call that stripped away the illusion of perpetual order. The territory has responded by building a more fortified, more aware, and more capable system of justice, but the work is never finished. It requires a constant, active effort to maintain the standards that have been established and a persistent focus on the safety of the public and those who protect it. The story of Lucilla Brown is, therefore, a living document, one that is updated with every new officer, every judicial session, and every day of peace that the territory enjoys. It is the narrative of a community that has learned, through the most difficult of paths, that the price of their tranquility is the constant, unwavering commitment to the rule of law. In conclusion, the history of this tragedy is one of a community that refused to be defined by its darkest moment. Instead, it chose to use that moment as the foundation for a more resilient future. The Fagatogo shooting remains the definitive, transformative event in the modern history of American Samoa, a moment that split the past from the present and paved the way for a more secure era. As the story of this evolution continues to be told, it serves as a testament to the fact that when a society is confronted with its own vulnerabilities, it has the capacity to build a shield that is both strong enough to protect its citizens and flexible enough to honor its traditions. The name of Lucilla Brown will continue to shine as a beacon of dedication, a constant reminder that the work of law enforcement is a sacred, vital, and perilous duty, and that the sacrifice of those who serve is the bedrock upon which the safety and liberty of the entire community are built. Moving forward into the future, the lessons of the past will remain the guide, ensuring that the progress made since that fateful July morning is never lost, and that the territory of American Samoa continues to flourish as a place where the rule of law and the protection of its citizens are held in the highest, most absolute regard. This is the enduring, final promise of the community to its fallen hero, and it is a promise that will be kept as long as there is an officer standing on the front line to represent the values for which he gave his life, maintaining the order and the peace that define a society dedicated to the pursuit of justice and the safety of all its people.